In this video, we're going to explore the Subharmonicon's pitch sequencing section. This includes these 8 knobs as well as all 8 of the buttons in the oscillator section. Let's begin by exploring the relationship between sequencer 1 and oscillator 1. You can see these 3 buttons here allow us to select whether the sequencer is controlling oscillator 1, suboscillator 1, suboscillator 2, or a combination of the 3. Let's start by just selecting oscillator 1 and making sure that rhythm 1 is controlling sequencer 1, and listen to how it sounds. You can hear that we end up with a simple 4-note sequence. Next, let's deselect oscillator 1 and select suboscillator 1 and fade suboscillator 1 up. It's important to note that the suboscillators work differently from the main oscillator because the suboscillator's frequencies are always going to be derived from the main oscillator's frequency. There's only 16 positions that these knobs can hit, and therefore only 16 positions that the sequencer will be able to hit in turn. Let's hit play and hear how it sounds. Notice that with only suboscillator 1 selected, VCO1 is staying the same pitch throughout all the steps, and what we're hearing is the sequencer selecting the intervals between the 2 oscillators. Now, let's select oscillator 1 and suboscillator 1 and listen to how that sounds. You can hear that this results in a sequence in which all 4 steps have 2 different pitches per step. Suboscillator 2's selection button functions exactly the same way as suboscillator 1. Next, let's look at the sequencer octave and quantize buttons in the oscillator section. The sequencer octave is allowing you to select the range that the sequencer is able to hit in a knob turn. Right now I have plus and minus 1 octave selected, which yields a 2-octave range, but you can also select plus and minus 5 octaves for a 10-octave range, and plus and minus 2 octaves for a 4-octave range. The quantizer button is allowing us to restrict which notes the sequencer is able to hit as you turn the knob. There's 5 possible selections. There's a 12-note equal tempered, 8-note equal tempered, 12-note just intonation, 8-note just intonation, and with no LEDs on, we get an unquantized sequencer. For more information on the difference between equal temperament and just intonation, please reference the manual. Now, let's look at what happens when we use both sequencers to control oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. I'm going to fade oscillator 2 up and make sure that rhythm 2 is assigned to control sequencer 2. And I'm going to make sure that rhythm 1 and rhythm 2 are set to have different tempos. You can hear 2 things. The first is we have a polyrhythm happening, which we talked about in the polyrhythm video, and we have both sequencers moving at different notes and at different times. Now let's listen to what it sounds like when we introduce the suboctaves. This lets you hear the paraphonic nature of the Subharmonicon. And when I say paraphonic, I mean that all 6 of these oscillators are fed into a single filter and a single VCA, each with their own envelopes. Both sequencers will trigger the envelopes no matter which one moves, and because of this, every single time one sequencer moves, you'll be able to hear all 6 oscillators if you have them turned up in the mixer. Next, let's look at what happens when we assign sequencer 1 to control suboscillator 1, and sequencer 2 to control suboscillator 2 while we listen to all 6 oscillators. As you can hear, things start to get more complex, and sometimes we end up with slightly more dissonant tones. These can all be adjusted by ear using either the sub-oscillator knobs or the sequencer knobs. Playing with different combinations of the sequencer pitches, the sequencer assignment, sequencer range, and quantization settings can yield all sorts of interesting results. One good way to design which pitches and harmonies you're hearing is to use the trigger button, the next button, and the reset button. The trigger will let us audition all of our notes and make adjustments if we don't like what we hear. Moving through the next button lets us hear all the various interval combinations that we'll get as the two sequencers play. So now we can listen to the adjusted sequence. As you can see, the Subharmonicon is a deep instrument with lots of interesting combinations to explore.